Peace and freedom and grace be with you. Thank you for joining us again for another episode of Hardfire. We're in the middle of a very vigorous discussion about 9/11 truth issues or 9/11 debunking, pertaining mainly to Building 7. We have two extraordinary guests. We have Richard GAGE by video feed, who is head of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. And we have Mark Roberts, who is a very well-researched 9/11 truth debunker. And we're in the middle of, part of it was a structured discussion, which is in our first presentation, and we're still in the middle of that. We're closing up on that, and then we're going to have more of a freewheeling conversation about this controversy, about what brought down the Solomon building of World Trade Center, or better known as Building 7. Mark was in the middle of a rebuttal to a point relating to, you can explain it.
Relating to Richard's claim that tons of molten iron, he says, were found under the World Trade Center buildings after they collapsed. Again, this material was never tested. We don't know exactly what it was. We do know it was very hot there. Of course, there were raging fires in those buildings for a long time. Building 7 burned for about 7 hours. We don't know if it was hot enough to melt steel, as Richard is claiming. These are anecdotal observations that he's talking about, which is natural to say. If you pull up a red-hot column, which is not anywhere near the melting temperature of steel, I and you might say that's molten steel right there. Now, I've talked to many people who were at the site afterwards and who were instrumental in the cleanup operations, from grappler operators to fire department people in charge of safety, to the structural engineers who were underground and actually looking at this stuff. None of them saw anything resembling what Richard says, tons of iron. He's making that up, by the way. Dave Peraza, the structural engineer in charge of the whole cleanup operation there, said to me, "I never saw pools or lakes of molten or previously molten steel, neither in the subgrade levels nor as material that was loaded onto trucks by the grapplers and cranes." And he says, by the way, some of the conspiracy theories state that the steel was sent to scrapyards, presumably to destroy evidence of the conspiracy. I participated in that decision, ultimately made by the DDC, not to retain the majority of the steel. I guess I was part of the conspiracy, he says.
So, just one question about, there are firefighters who also said that they saw molten steel or described it as such. Are they not expert witnesses, or only the critics of 9/11 Truth experts?
Not at all, because other metals that melt at much lower temperatures can appear to be golden and molten like that also.
But was he, as a firefighter, qualified enough to know the difference?
Not at all. Not at all. One thing we see is that, for example, in the parking lots, the aluminum wheels, alloy wheels, had melted off the cars. Richard's not going to claim that the terrorists were in there putting thermite on the wheels of cars, I don't think. We know it was that hot in areas that were both under the buildings and around the buildings. Just from the fires, an incredible amount of fuel, just from the fires that occurred for several months afterwards.
Okay, Richard, is it possible, if you're there, Richard, is it possible that there are other explanations for the fire that allow for the possibility that it wasn't molten after a couple of weeks? Are you there, Richard? Oh, we've had a problem with the cutting out of Richard's end of the conversation.
I'll address something that Richard might want to bring up, that NIST doesn't take on this interesting thing. Well, NIST does, and they're frequently asked questions in 2006 and 2007. They say it's conceivable that under certain conditions in the piles that some steel could have melted, and I can't say that it couldn't, nor can Richard say that it could.
I'm back.
Okay, Richard, well, there's been a discussion here about the fires and information that suggests that there are not qualified people who actually saw the fires raging that could say that they were molten after several weeks or whatever. What do you say to that?
Well, there's two thoughts there. Let's stay with the molten metal. I agree with Mark completely that molten metal is not a result of classic controlled demolition. We're not talking about classic controlled demolition.
You just were talking about classic controlled demolition.
Thought, 1 second. You call me a liar and then interrupt me. It doesn't work for me, Mark. There has been found in the molten metal the chemical evidence of thermite, an incendiary used to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter. This is found by Dr. Stephen Jones in several samples of the molten iron, and it is not melted steel, it is molten iron. There are also microspheres found throughout the dust. In fact, every dust sample collected by not only Dr. Jones, but by the USGS, by R.J. Lee, finds these iron-rich microspheres 20 minutes away on the Brooklyn Bridge, across the street in Jeanette McKinley's apartment, and on top of the high-rise 2 blocks away. All of these contain these iron-rich microspheres with potassium, manganese, iron, and aluminum. This is the chemical signature of thermite, this incendiary.
Okay.
All right.
Richard, you mentioned the environmental report by R.J. Lee about contents of dust that mentioned these iron microspheres. In what context were they mentioning these spheres? Why were they talking about them? I'll give you up some of my time for that.
R.J. Lee found the iron-rich microspheres. If you look at this photo here, in fact.
Oh, we can't see that. Just quickly, though, Richard, I do want some of my time. Why were they talking about it?
They're talking about it because they didn't know what the hell it was. They had never seen anything like it. In fact, FEMA can't.
Okay, that's enough. That's all I need to hear. That's all I need to hear, and it's entirely false. They talked about it because those iron-rich microspheres were an expected product of the fires. They were looking for them as a signature of World Trade Center dust to differentiate it from the dust, the background dust in other buildings for environmental studies they were doing. Expected to be found. It is, Richard, and if you say it's not true, you haven't read the report.
There is no possible source for these iron-rich microspheres except for an aluminothermic reaction under extremely pressurized conditions in which the surface tension forms these spheres into these tiny these spheres, some of which are hollow, as this molten iron cools. And what is in these spheres? All of them: aluminum, iron, potassium, manganese. This, again, is the chemical signature of thermite.
Absolutely not. You're absolutely wrong.
May I suggest the possibility that you're both right, that these traces are representative of a thermite residue or thermite signature, and because this is what was unique to World Trade Center and the collapse of those buildings, that's what was the key thing to look for if you were going to distinguish the fire damage and debris from World Trade Center from debris from everywhere else.
Absolutely not, because all of the materials that Richard says was in these things were expected to be found on the site just from normal building collapses from a normal building fire. All of them.
How about this
all
one?
of them.
Chips that are 1/16 of an inch long, that have the unignited thermite in them. This is high-tech stuff, nano-sized particles of iron and aluminum. This is not a product that's found in any office whatsoever. We have, again, potassium, manganese, iron, aluminum, and this is extremely explosive stuff that's found by, that's only recently been produced in papers by Lawrence Livermore Lab, Los Alamos. This stuff is not made in a cave in Afghanistan. We know the source of the iron-rich microspheres because they're partially attached to these tiny chips found in every sampling of dust that Dr. Jones and others have found now.
Glad to address that, Richard. You're right. They're not made, these chips of that iron-bearing material are not made in a cave in Afghanistan. They're made in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania by the Pittsburgh Paint Company. They're made in Kansas City, Missouri by the Tnemec Paint Company.
That's why they're extremely explosive, I suppose.
One thing that should ring a bell is that they look exactly like all the primer paint that's on the structural steel, and in fact they're described as these eggshell-like chips. There's a gray side to them also. What is that gray side, Richard?
It appears to be some sort of binder. It's
right. It is a binder.
Now, the other side.
All of the, Richard, let me finish. All of the ingredients in those chips are in the primer paint. This information is in the NIST report. They look like paint chips.
No reason for sulfur being in there, or aluminum, or
indeed there is, Richard. If you read
nano-sized particles that are
indeed there is, Richard. If you read or do as I do and contact the paint companies, they can tell you what's in them. But NIST even tells you what's in some of these paints. All of these things are 36% iron oxide in the pigment of the World Trade Center structural steel paint.
May I bring up a point that one of the reasons we're able to have a discussion about what this residue or signature signifies is because the other side, the 9/11 Truth investigating side, was able to get some portion of some of the debris from some of the buildings. Almost all of it was unavailable to independent researchers.
Not true.
Apart from what got to Dr. Stephen Jones.
Thomas Cahill in California. Lots and lots of people have studied the dust because they were doing health studies. Lots of people have. The dust that Richard's talking about was collected, most of it well after the events. People are doing torch.
We're not just talking about the dust. I'm talking about actual steel stuff.
This is what we're talking about.
Well, let's look at the North Tower, because this is where most of these iron-rich microspheres were produced, is in the explosions of these 90,000 tons of concrete, which is found missing at the bottom of both the North and the South Tower. In fact, there's 110 floors that collapsed. We would expect to see 50 or 20. We don't even see one floor. In fact, they've been shredded. Not only the concrete, but the decking and the floor trusses underneath. Not one has been found. It pulverized this concrete to like 10 microns, smaller than a human hair, most of it. Let's look at the collapse of the North Tower now. It's really important.
Well, Richard, can we address that point first? Because it sounds like we're skipping around a bit.
Okay, go ahead.
You say that 90,000 tons of concrete is missing and all that, and that virtually everything is pulverized to a very fine dust, micron-sized dust. Here's a quote from someone who examined some of the World Trade Center dust. We found large chunks of concrete as well as medium-sized pieces of wallboard with the binding paper still attached. Thus, the pulverization was not, in fact, to fine dust, and it is a false premise to start with near-complete pulverization to fine powder. But you disagree with that, Richard?
Yes, we also
Okay, that's all I need. That's from your research partner, Dr. Stephen Jones. So he disagrees with you. You should probably talk to him about that. Now, Richard just said that.
I'm looking for one.
Let me finish it.
I think he doesn't mean to.
A few pancakes, that's all I'm asking for. Just
Richard,
give it to me.
You say these don't exist. You're waiting for people to deliver this stuff to your door rather than doing the research, as I have done. I'll send you accounts, and I'll put this on my website. I'll have a page devoted to this conversation of people who saw 14 floors compressed to 8 feet, who saw 20 floors compressed to 10 feet. At JFK Airport, you can see a portion of 4 stories that are compressed to about 4 feet.
Well, let me just
with the floor pans in them. Richard says none of these things are visible. I have literally hundreds of photos that show the floor pans from the floors and the trusses. Now, they don't look good. They're in bad shape. If you take 4 pieces of regular copy paper, lay them down out flat, 4 or 5 pieces, that's how thick the floors were in relation to the long side of this paper.
Okay.
Well, we'll see about that. I've been looking for them, and I haven't seen them, so I appreciate your willingness to show them. But we had 110 floors, and the point is that most all of them are missing. If you look at the base of both of these towers after they fall, there is only a pile of 2 to 3 story structural steel and aluminum cladding. All of the photos show that. There are no floors found at the top or anywhere near that pile. Maybe down in the basement is what you're referring to. That's not what I'm referring to.
Okay, I have to interrupt once again and do a announcement about what this show is about. Hardfire is brought to you by libertarians in New York. We hope that all of you who are watching this in New York and elsewhere in the country appreciate our commitment to liberty and to truth, and we hope that you will support the Libertarian Party in those efforts to further to bring freedom back to the country and to our state. In New York, you can go to manhattanlp.org to find out about the activity of the Manhattan Libertarian Party. In Queens, you can go to lpqc.org to see what we're doing in Astoria and elsewhere in Queens. And for state activity, you should look at ny.lp.org, which will apprise you as to the activism of the state party in bringing back liberty to New York. And we hope that this show will be inspiration to you to continue watching and continue supporting libertarians in New York and the U.S. Mark is going to speak again, but I just have to say...
Well, Mark just spoke.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Let's talk about the North Tower. The North Tower begins its collapse, as you can see here on the photo. The 15 stories above the collapse zone are compressing in on itself such that within 4 seconds this entire upper section, which is supposed to drive this building down at free fall speed almost, against 80,000 tons of cold, intact, hard structural steel. But what we can see is there's no pile driver after 4 seconds. The building is tearing itself apart after that, hurling debris every direction symmetrically at 70 to 100 miles an hour, instant acceleration out of the building, landing up to 600 feet laterally.
Okay.
Okay, let me address some of those points.
But before you do, I just
Sure.
want to get this point, and I keep getting cut off.
Sorry.
That when you refer to research and ask the other side to refer to the research, it is often a second-hand nature of it, in the sense of somebody has to look at what somebody else was able to look at firsthand. And all I'm suggesting is, in a lot of these controversies about whether it is a cover-up or a conspiracy, there's a question of independent access to the evidence by people who disagree with the official story. And when they do their own research, they're told, "Oh, look at the research of the people who did stuff that agrees with us."
No one is stopping them from hiring competent engineering firms to do some of these research, to create computer models.
Access to the evidence, direct access to the concrete or the steel debris from
How would you propose to get that in 2008?
It'd be nice if they had been able to been equally accessible to both sides of a question, so that there could have been a determination.
On my website, you can see, for one thing, I'd like to refer people to a video, which are sometimes easier to digest, called World Trade Center 7, not a demolition that I made. It addresses almost all the points, actually all the points that we're talking about in these conversations. The amount of explosives that Richard is talking about that would pulverize all the concrete in the buildings is in the hundreds of tons, only if you drilled holes in all that concrete and placed the explosives close together. I don't think he's claiming that happened, but this is the realm of science fiction. There are no detonations. And here's a challenge. Here's a challenge to you, Richard.
The way you would plant these explosives, I'm going to tell you, you would need access through the elevators, and if you did have access through the elevator hoistways, you could plant those explosives in the core of each of these twin towers without the 50,000 occupants knowing. In fact, there was an elevator modernization going on the 9 months prior to 9/11, which there was plenty of white dust being produced. Perhaps that's the 2 layers of 3/4-inch gypsum board which protected this hoistway from fire. But there's a very plausible, rational explanation as to how 1,300 pounds, according to some estimates, not tons like you're saying.
Sir, to pulverize concrete with explosives, to pulverize all that concrete to dust, and I would refer people to a paper that's posted in the Journal of Engineering Mechanics by Zdenek Bezant and others. Hundreds of tons, Rich.
Well, we don't have Mark. If you're a detective and you walk into a room and you have a dead body on the ground with 3 shell casings, you don't have to know how they did it, how they got away with it, what their motive was, in order to produce a fully open investigation that's open to everybody. And we did not have such an investigation.
Now, Richard, you mentioned that the North Tower. Where you mentioned the elevator shafts, you realize that where the collapse initiated in the North Tower, many of the core columns were actually exposed in the office areas, not enclosed within the core, right?
There are indeed some core columns that aren't immediately adjacent.
Right, quite a few. Let's keep in mind that in the 1993...
They had access from the elevator
Richard,
shaft.
in the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center, that involved about 1,000 pounds of TNT equivalent in a truck bomb. Didn't destroy a single column. Richard is alleging that thousands of tons of steel was blown all over the site. There are no detonations. And here's my challenge to you, Richard. Let's take the Evan Fairbanks footage of Building 2 collapsing. The east side bows inward as the collapse begins.
Well, in fact, I've got that video. Let's look at it.
Richard, let me get my challenge out. It's really important.
It's also really important that we get at least one of the other points in, because there was one other presentation, 2-minute presentation he had to make.
Okay.
Richard, is that the beginning of that one?
Yes. In fact, the South Tower begins its collapse. And the big building falls at an angle approaching 22 degrees. And yet, as you look which indicates that it would fall to the street in some mangled heap, right? But that's not what it does. It disappears and pulverizes into its individual structural members. Watch what happens, though, from underneath. Even though we have asymmetrical damage and asymmetrical collapse, what we have surrounding the building is explosions wrapping, like the first responders cited, 118 of them, in fact, citing sounds of explosions at the initiation of this collapse. Watch what happens as this building comes down. It's symmetrical and virtually at free fall speed. All of these columns are removed and hurled laterally at 70 to 100 miles an hour out of the building, some of them 200 miles an hour. How does that happen from a gravitational collapse induced by fire?
Here we go. You said that, and here's my challenge that I wanted to get out. We'll take the Evan Fairbanks footage, which is real close-up footage of the beginning of the South Tower collapse, where the wall bows inward. Richard, if you will point out to me where the detonations occurred preceding that inward bowing, I will quit my debunking activities. I will remove my website. I'll apologize to you and everyone else in the truth movement, and you will never hear from me again in this context. So that's all you need to do. And if you can't, and Richard, if you can't do that,
answer that question.
And Richard, if you can't do that, I would only ask that you put up on your website.
For you.
What you do is you take some thermite and you remove the core columns. That'll pull on the trusses and that'll pull on the exterior.
No, sir, Richard, because you claim that the witnesses heard these explosions before the collapse began.
They might not have heard before
The collapse, and then they heard the ones as the collapse.
This is not what you say in all of your presentations.
And I would say,
it's not what you say in all of your presentations.
in contradistinction, you would also said, it has to be said that you said the witnesses are not necessarily reliable.
Let me talk about these 118 witnesses, okay? This is a paper by a Buddhism scholar named Graham McQueen. He says that even though none of these people actually believe that explosives happened, someone sort of got to them and convinced them that the official story is true. 57 of these people didn't see one or both of the collapses. 38 didn't describe anything like an explosion coming from the towers. 29 of them clarified their statements in some way. 58 had no idea that what they were experiencing was the collapse of a tower. And here's something that Richard really doesn't want you to know. Of all the people who described seeing both of the collapses and used the term like an explosion or I thought it was a bomb going off, only 2 of them use a similar term for the other collapse. And when you read the accounts in context, that's perfectly clear because they had no idea what was happening with the first collapse. They weren't expecting it. So usually they would hear it, look up, see the building starting coming down, and they're running for their lives.
I encourage
now, Richard, on your website and in your presentations, you say 118 people, first responders, also saw flashes. Guess how many the real number is out of the 503 accounts that those are taken from? The real number is 2, Richard. But what you did is you took those 2 accounts, you split them up into several accounts, and didn't identify them each time to pretend like more people said they saw flashes. 2 people said they saw flashes.
Let me respond.
I encourage the listeners, the viewers of this program, to go to Journal of 9/11 Studies and read the report themselves.
So do I.
It is
thoroughly convincing.
I encourage them to go to my site.
Let him finish. Let Richard finish.
You're going to be fair with
me, or we're not going to have a debate.
This makes me mad.
Many of these of the reporters, dozens of them, recording, feeling the explosions in their bodies, 1,700 feet down at the ground level, as these explosions were happening up above.
Name one.
Now, let's talk. Let me bring up the next subject. Otherwise, we'll just rehash the same type of argument. Now, we're going to talk about how these buildings came down. I have with me 110. I have a 95-story building. I have 2 15-story buildings that I'm going to drop. I'm holding them up. I'm going to drop them at the same time. This is going to show that we have what amounts as a virtual free fall speed, unimpeded, as I'm dropping the 15-story building over nothing at all on one side and over a 95-story building on the other. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Oh my God, the one that had no resistance under it falls at free fall speed. What happens over here? The one that has 80,000 tons of structural steel on it. It doesn't even give. it resists and is met by an equal and opposite reaction known as the conservation of momentum. It doesn't fall. You can see these technical papers on our website, ae911truth.org, and it is incredible. It shows that this
building should never have collapsed.
I'd like to address that real quickly. I can do
yes,
30
and
seconds.
just a real quick one statement of mine, because we're running out of time again, is that I don't see it being necessary that Building 7 collapsed if it was a controlled demolition in the same, it was set up to be in the same exact fashion as Buildings 1 and 2, if they were collapsed by controlled demolition. And therefore, to compare the two and witness descriptions compared to the two, it might be inappropriate because it may have been done by slightly different mechanisms.
I'm not the one claiming that they're both signs of controlled demolition. Richard is. But what Richard does in his, which is again deceptive in his presentations, he takes a video clip from the film Loose Change of the South Tower collapse to show that this free fall is happening. Well, the clip starts about 2.5 seconds into the collapse of the building.
This tells us it was 9 or 10 seconds, depending on the south and the north story.
Now, the actual collapse of that building took around 14 seconds. If you delay the collapse by about 4 seconds, that means that the lower portion of the building is absorbing about 48 tons of TNT equivalent energy. So the idea that the building is not resisting is absolutely nonsensical, that it's being torn apart by that much energy.
If the building was resisting, it wouldn't have fallen.
Again, Richard, let me finish one point. I'll refer people.
Let's talk about
Richard, let me finish.
We're down to about 1 minute here, close to 1 minute.
We need 20 seconds, Mark, and then I'll go.
Don't even need it. Again, a paper in Journal of Engineering Mechanics. I refer to all these papers on my website. Richard's people actually have 0 technical papers that are published in any respected journals. I take you through all.
That's
of
the character statement about whether they're respected journals.
I link to all of these papers where you can read direct refutations of what Richard is saying. I've got 165 structural engineers listed who actually worked on the investigations, as opposed to.
We have 20 structural engineers.
Yes,
who are
your most outspoken one says that nuclear weapons were used against the towers. Do you believe that?
And we also
have squibs that occur 20, 40, and 60 stories below the collapsing building that are ejections of 100 to 160 feet per second. These cannot be puffs of air produced by this non-existent pile driver. They are 60 stories down below. They're pulverized building materials, and they're highly focalized at the geometric midpoints between the corners of the building. These can only be explosions.
And that's where we have to leave it, because we're just plain out of time. This has been an energetic conversation. I suggest you strongly look at both websites and critically compare all the claims being made back and forth. Join us for another exciting adventure or episode next time on Hardfire.
Live free or die. Live free or die.
Hardfire is funded in part by the Libertarian Party of New York. www.ny.lp.org. Catering for the cast and crew of Hardfire is generously provided by Da Vincenzo Restaurant, 256 Prospect Park West, Brooklyn, New York, 11215. 718-369-3590. www.davincenzorestaurant.com.